Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for these two 1/6 scale Maybach HL210 engines. One of the engines that you see in this video here is built for commission and belongs to a private collector. As I often mention in these videos, I often take on build commissions from models ranging from 1/35 scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. As for availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. As for the engines themselves, they are the full resin kits, which are listed on the eastcoastarmory.com product line. On the ECA catalog, you'll see the engines listed in several different formats, as in unassembled kits, fully built assembled versions here, as well as even half engines, which are designed for engine compartment use for radio control tanks. As well as the HL210, which is what these engines are replicating, I also have the HL230 and the HL230 with the cyclone air cleaners. Images as well as videos on all those engines are actually found on the ECA website, the ECA Facebook page, as well as even on the ECA YouTube channel. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around each of these engines in order to get a better view of them. This engine here is the Maybach HL210. The HL210 engine was the engine which was initially intended to be used on the Tiger I heavy tank. The Maybach HL210, as well as the later HL230, were both 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled gasoline engines. Now, there is this common misconception that's been floating around the internet as well as tank fans for a while, in that the Tiger tank and the Panthers were diesel-powered. This was not the case. The Tiger and the Panthers were, as well as even the Panzer IVs, and for that matter, all of the other German AFV of the time, were gasoline-powered exclusively. The engines were unique in that they had an aluminum crankcase and block. The HL210s would have been found in the initial and early pattern of Tiger Is, and approximately 250 of these engines were produced, and 250 of them were installed in the first batch of Tiger Is that were made. The engines had a displacement of 1,303 cubic inches, a bore of 4.9 inches, and a stroke of 5.7. The engine had a horsepower which was below 690. These engines were deemed to be underpowered to power a heavy tank like the Tiger I, so Maybach went ahead and tweaked and altered the design, thus resulting with the HL230. The HL230 had the horsepower bumped up, as well as a few other changes that were made to the engine design itself. The HL230 is what was predominantly found on the Tiger Is for the rest of the Tiger I's production run. These engines were also adapted for use on the Panther and the King Tiger. And the second engine. Both the Maybach HL210 and HL230 have a poor reputation with reliability as well as frequently breaking down. This, however, was due to more of the initial batch when these tanks were first sent to Kursk. Both the original Tiger I and the Panthers were really rushed into production, and the bugs really weren't worked out yet of the engines as well as the tank designs themselves. These engines are more reliable than a lot of people give them credit for. Another problem with these engines also occurred in Russia during the Russian winter. Since these engines are water cooled, they can freeze up with the sub-zero temperatures. Which is why a common practice was to keep the engines warm was to actually light a fire underneath the engine bay of the tank, to which the heat from the fire will actually keep the engine bay slightly warm, and thus the engine fluids will not freeze over. Currently, there are two HL210 engines still left in existence. One of them is on display in the Bovington Tank Museum, and that was the engine which was found in Tiger 131 when it was originally captured. That engine was removed out of the tank and was turned into a cutaway, which is why currently the Bovington Tiger runs with an HL230. The other HL210 is housed in the Fort Benning Army Base, as currently their Tiger 1 is being restored, and that vehicle, being a older version than the 131, also is equipped with an HL210. Now, both of these models here are built out of the exact same kit and feature the exact same detailing and the exact same functions. The difference between the two is that one of the engines that you see here was left in an unweathered mint state, while this version here was added with the weathering. The clean one is the one that is built for the commission, and the weathered one is for my own personal collection. Now, for anyone who's a fan of the channel, you will know that I've had the HL210 Maybach engine kits around for a few years now. However, one addition that I made and alteration that I upgraded the kit with is featured on these models here, and we'll be going over those as well as the other features and details in this video. Starting with the oil tank, this is the one modification that I made to the ECA kit. The ECA kit, when first released, originally had the oil tank, which was that of the HL230. Both the HL210 and the HL230 featured external oil tanks, which are mounted on the left side of the engine. The HL230s, like I said, was more bulbous in appearance compared to the box step setup that you have here on the HL210. Now, it's not necessarily inaccurate to have an HL210 with the HL230 style oil tank, as the two oil tanks were interchangeable with each other, and it's not uncommon for tanks to have different parts swapped in field. However, all HL210 kits sold by ECA will feature the squared oil tank from here on end. To walk through the other side detailing, it's standard that of your average HL210 and 230 engines. On this side here, in addition to the oil tank, we have here the starter system. This long rod that's connected to the starter, this is the inertia starter. This is how you manually crank the engine to start it without having the use of the electric starter, which is located directly below. If we notice here, there's a small little plug. This would connect to the tank's electrical system, which would start the engine via a large gear that's found on this portion here of the crankcase. And here we have the face of the engine. The engine's face that you see here, if we notice there are several bolts that are missing. This is because on the real tank, this portion here is what actually would connect to the firewall, and would connect to the firewall via the fastener locations that we have present on this model. Now, here on this portion here, this is the output shaft. This is actually what goes to the front of the tank and powers the transmission, which powers the vehicle. As you can see, it uses a standard flexible universal joint. As you see, it's functional on the model. And in addition to that, the ECA kit is unique in that the whole spindle can rotate. Moving up from the cover takes us to the fuel lines. As you can see, the fuel lines emerge from this side of the vehicle, and they run their way along the top portion into the upper extremity of the engine. While on the fuel lines, this is where the fuel lines actually start on the model. The fuel would be connected to this hose here, which would connect to the fuel cells, which are located on both the sides of the engine in the engine compartment, and also the two main ones, which are located on the top over the sponsons. The fuel is, I believe, gravity fed. There is no fuel pump, and the fuel enters into first a filtration system. Now, if anyone is accustomed to old antique tractors or antique engines, you'll know what I'm referring to. This tank here features what's called as a sediment filter. On old engines, the way these sediment filters worked was that the fuel would enter into this assembly, and the fuel would actually fill up into these little glass jars. If there's any sort of dirt, debris, or rust, or any type of solid particulate, the particulate would settle in the jar towards the bottom as it's heavier than the actual fluid itself. With the sediment on the bottom, the liquid fuel will then flow out of the filter and then run through the rest of the fuel system into the carburetors. On the ECA kit, these components here are casted in clear resin, thus giving for the most amount of accuracy for these parts as possible. As for the jars, they connect to the filter mount with that of a steel little strap pin. This is as per the real vehicle and replicated on the ECA kit. Directly in front of the sediment filters are that of the water condenser. Inside the real vehicle, there is a system of coils which cools down the fluid to enter back into the engine. This component is actually connected to the radiators and other plumbing of the cooling system, which is actually described in more detail in other videos found on the video channel. Directly above the cooling system is that of the alternator. It's hard to get into frame, however the alternator is mounted directly above the coolant condenser tube. On this side of the engine, directly above the sediment filters, is that of your oil filter. By removing these three fasteners, you can remove this plate and remove the engine's oil filter. As for another distinctive feature on the HL210 and the HL230 for that matter, is that of this large built-in duct. This duct here connects to this tube, which connects to the condenser and is what flows into the water pump and then gets cycled throughout the engine. Moving towards the back of the engine takes us to first the pressed metal engine stand. The stand, the way it works is that it connects to the engine block, and then this entire mount gets bolted directly to the floor of the Tiger. Now, as we recall, there's no engine stand on the front of the engine, as the entire front plugs into a mount to the tank's firewall. So the front engine stand is not necessary. Moving from the stand to the flywheel. The flywheel that you see here is connected to the output shaft and is fully functional as well. As you can see, it can rotate. Now, if anyone is a fan of the channel, you will notice that on several other of my Tiger 1 builds, both static and radio controlled, I was able to actually make this component fully functional and animated. Moving from the flywheel takes us to the starter, or I should say the inertia starter. The inertia starter on the HL210 is found on this channel mechanism, and there is a small little cogwheel setup which connects to the manual starter, which was showcased earlier. Now, on the HL210, had a different layout compared to the HL230. The HL210 setup was a horizontal bar that had a clutch mechanism which disconnected the flywheel starter from the flywheel itself. This was done so that you can start the engine with the inertia starter, and to do that there's a small little tool which connects to this little peg over here which engages the clutch. This system here was a bit complicated, and on the HL230 it was slightly changed, and the HL230, rather than having the bar in a straight horizontal plane, it's canted, and the flywheel is not connected to the cog chain for the manual starter. Moving up from the flywheel setup takes us to the eyelets. The engine has several eyelet points, 2 on the back of the engine and 2 more on the lower front portion of the engine. The purpose of the eyelets is in order to get the engine out of the vehicle via crane. You simply hook up snaps and hooks to these locations here, and with a hoist the entire engine is lifted out of the engine bay. Moving up towards the tank's exhaust manifolds, the Tiger 1 featured a very unique system for the exhaust manifold. The exhaust manifolds are located underneath 2 giant heat shields which run the entire length of the engine. Now, one thing that's unique about the Tiger 1 is that the heat shields double acted as an actual air duct. The way the Tiger 1 engine was mounted into the vehicle was that, like I said before, the front of the engine mounts to the firewall. Well, immediately on the opposite side of the firewall, there is a impeller and a duct system. This duct system aids as the air circulation for the vehicle, but also adds as an air circulation for the engine compartment, as well as even the exhaust manifolds themselves. This was done to reduce the heat of the exhaust manifold, which, as one can imagine, does get quite hot. The Tiger 1's exhaust manifold would connect to the air duct via 2 little plates which would mount on this portion here of the duct, as well as then the exhaust tips would then mount to another duct which is located on the rear wall of the vehicle. This air would then be funneled all out of the exhaust manifolds, which are found on the back of the Tiger. In addition to the impeller, there is also 2 more air ducts which help funnel out the exhaust, which connect to the tank's cooling fans, of which there's again more information on that in the other videos in my video listings. Now, another feature that's interesting on the Maybach is that the exhaust manifolds are not symmetrical. If you can see here, the one on the right hand side bends inward in this location, while the one on the right hand side is a straight line, and there is a choke point found on the end. Moving up from the exhaust takes us to first the oil filler tube. As you can see, since the Maybach engine has its oil in an external tank, to fill it needs to be done with an external tube. The tube is a long flat tube which has a unique geometry, the way it bends and has to curve around the exhaust manifold. As you can see, it is very close to the top of the engine and is very easily accessible. With opening the engine hatch, you can easily get access to the oil filler. There's a small little screw. You unscrew this with your thumbs, and then you would pull out the dipstick, which, like on all engines, shows you how much oil and level you have left. You could then screw back on the dipstick, and then you can unscrew the entire head, which will allow you to put a funnel to refill the oil. Moving up from the oil filler takes us to the rocker arm covers. The rocker arm covers is one very distinctive trait which separates the HL230 with the HL210. The rocker arm covers on the HL230 are a slightly different design, in which, as we can see here, on the HL210, there is a very large tower which emits from the rocker arm cover in order to mount on the magneto. This system was swapped out on the HL230, and the magneto locations were moved from on top of the rocker arm covers to on the center portion right above the clutch for the cooling system. In addition to the rocker arm cover being different with the magneto, it's also different with the other filler cap. On the HL210, there are two small identical filler caps which are located on either side of the rocker arm cover. On the HL230, this design was changed. Instead of having two of the same size caps, you have one smaller cap on the front of the engine, and on the back of the engine you would have a larger cap mounted more in the center of the cover itself. Also, another unique feature of the HL210 and 230 series is that the rocker arm covers are non-symmetrical. So much so that they're even labeled in the casting themselves. On the right-hand one, we have here the German word for Rex, which means right. And on the left-hand version, the German word links, or left, is present. Also, an interesting side note is that on the real vehicle, the rocker arm covers were actually made of aluminum. Moving towards the front of the engine, the rocker arms have their air intakes mounted onto them. These are as per the real images of the 210 engines that I've seen. They mount directly onto the rocker arm cover, which is directly in front of the magnetos. Now, moving our way to the center takes us to the cooling system gearbox. One very unique feature that these German tanks had was that to power the cooling fans in the cooling system, this was done via a external mounted gearbox. As you can see here on the face here of the gearbox, there's a small flange. This flange would bolt to a universal joint and a drive shaft. This small length of drive shaft will connect to the fan gearbox, which would then power the fans via the same revolutions that are powering the engine. Now, one very unique capability of these Maybach engines, both the 230 and the 210, was that there was an ability to shut off the gearbox in order to kill the fans. The reason for that is that these tanks were originally designed for fording and snorkeling capabilities. When the vehicle would enter into that process, one of the waterproofing systems and the snorkeling systems would involve that of killing that of the cooling system. And the way this was done was, you can see on this one here with the air filter system off, is there's a small little clevis located on the side of the gearbox. This would connect to an arm, and when pulled by the crew member, would disconnect the gearbox from the flywheel, thus halting the fan system in its place. In addition to the shut off for the cooling system, you could also see the main tubes in which the engine would connect to the cooling system for the radiator clusters. On the HL230, this is a very different design. Rather than the single output shaft, they had a larger tower style assembly in which the magnetos were moved to this tower and would be facing towards the rear of the vehicle. In addition to the magnetos, the gearbox cluster was also different in that instead of having an external gearbox connected with the drive shaft, you had an internal gearbox which then teed off and went to either end of the engine compartment, to which then there would be another gearbox which would connect to the cooling fan system. Again, all this detailing is mentioned in more detail on another video. Moving our way to the front of the engine, there are two smaller water intakes which are found on the front, which would then also connect to the rest of the tank's cooling system. Moving to the top portion of the engine takes us to the air filtration system. As you can see, the 210 featured three smaller air filters which were found on top of this large duct. The air would enter via this slot here, and the fiber filters would filter the air prior to having them enter into the carburetors. Now, one difference between the 210 and the 230 was that when the larger tower style clutch mechanism was developed, the air filters were modified in that instead of having 3 smaller filters, you had 2 larger filters which were mounted on a smaller duct which was located in the center of the engine. Now, what's unique is that most of the tanks that went to North Africa featured the HL210 engine. And these were the same tanks that had the German Feifel system, which was an air filtration system that filtered the air before it would even enter into the engine compartment. Because of all the sand and grit that was found in North Africa, it was deemed that the air needed to be double filtered, which is why on the Feifel system, they are external. There were two clusters of cyclone air filters that would cycle out the air and separate the heavy particulate from the lighter air, which would then get drawn into the engine compartment. From there, it would go into this duct here, and the filters here would filter the air further. What's very interesting was that on the HL230, when the later versions of the engine, which went into the Panther and the King Tiger, they actually featured a built-in cyclone air filtration system, which was basically the early Feifel system, but really shrunk down and perfected to the point where it sits right on top of the engine halves themselves. More information on that is also found on another video. Like I said before, on the ECA kits, the air filters can be disconnected from the main engine, showing the detailing of the carburetors as well as the control rods and fuel lines. This setup here is identical to the HL230s. They both featured 4 carburetors. The one difference between the two, though, is that on the HL230 only features 2 of the sediment fuel filters as opposed to the 4 found on the 210s. On the 230s, the 2 would then split off and would be divided to enter into the 4 carburetors. As for the clevis and linkage system, all of the carburetors are hooked in line to each other and are then spring bound towards the rear of the engine, and everything would work in unison on the real engines. As for which is the actual control rod, that would be this rod over here, which comes off of the right hand front engine or front carburetor, and that would connect to that clevis, and this would connect to the fuel line cable, which is connected to the pedal of the driver. The same exact detailing was done to both of the engines, only on the commission build engine it is much cleaner compared to the weathered state that I have on the other unit. Now, if you're wondering which engine goes for which vehicle, that is actually very simple. The HL210 was used from the initial production Tigers and into the early production Tigers. These would be the Tigers that were in Leningrad and also the ones that were found in North Africa with the Feifel system and even into Italy. By the time the mid-production of the Tiger 1 started coming out, the engines were switched over from the HL210 to the HL230. The HL230 was then used from the mid-production all the way up to the end of the Tiger 1's production run. Now, like I said before, there was a Cyclone-equipped version of the HL230 engine. That engine was never used on the Tiger 1 and was only used on the Panther and the King Tiger. In addition to the Cyclone, on the Panther, there was 2 versions of the engine that were also used. You had the Cyclone Air Filtration 230, which was the one I just mentioned, but the early versions of the Panther, namely the Panther D and the Panther A, primarily used the standard HL230 that had the dual can air filtration system and not the Cyclone. As far as I know, no HL210s were utilized on the Panther series. However, if anyone does have evidence of this, feel free to write it in the comment section listed below, as it's always interesting to learn new facts about these vehicles and engines. And that concludes this model showcase video for these 1/6 scale HL210 Maybach engines. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, and don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.